Life has a way of making us question where we are headed. Some days everything seems to be falling into place, but then, without warning, challenges arise that shake our confidence. It is in those moments of uncertainty that we need to hold on to something greater than ourselves. The world tells us to rely on our own understanding, to create our own destiny, but the Bible reveals a different truth. God has already planned our future, and His plan is one of hope, not disaster. There's a verse tucked away in the book of Jeremiah that has the power to change the way we see our lives. It's a verse many have heard, yet few have truly grasped. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." At first glance, it sounds like a beautiful promise. But the true depth of its meaning is even more powerful when you understand the context. Jeremiah wrote these words to the Israelites at a time when they were in exile. They had lost everything, their land, their freedom, their sense of security. They felt abandoned by God, hopeless about what lay ahead. And right in the middle of their suffering, God sends them a message. "I have not forgotten you. My plan is still in motion. Trust me." Imagine what it must have felt like to hear those words when everything around them seemed to say otherwise. That's the kind of faith God calls us to have today. When life doesn't make sense, when the future looks uncertain, when everything seems to be crumbling, God is still working. His plan is not based on what we see or feel in the moment. He doesn't need perfect circumstances to accomplish His purpose in our lives. And He certainly isn't surprised by the struggles we face. In fact, sometimes He allows the hardship because He knows it will prepare us for the very future He has planned. Think about Joseph, a young man who had dreams of greatness. He believed that God had placed a calling on his life. But before he could step into that calling, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Year after year, it must have seemed like his dreams were slipping further away. Yet through every trial, God's plan was still unfolding. What seemed like setbacks were actually steps leading him to his destiny. And when the time was right, Joseph was elevated to a position of power, not just for his own benefit, but so that he could save an entire nation. What does that tell us? It tells us that the struggles we face today may very well be preparing us for something greater tomorrow. Just because we don't see the full picture doesn't mean that God isn't painting it. Just because the road is difficult doesn't mean we aren't headed in the right direction. But here's the part we often miss. Jeremiah 29:11 doesn't promise an immediate turnaround. It doesn't say, "I know the plans I have for you, and tomorrow everything will be perfect." No, God's timing is different from ours. His process is different from ours. The Israelites had to wait 70 years before they saw the fulfillment of God's promise. Joseph spent years in hardship before stepping into his purpose. Even Jesus himself went through years of preparation before stepping into his earthly ministry. The waiting is not wasted. God is working in the unseen. The enemy will try to convince you that because you don't see the breakthrough right now, it means that God has forgotten you. But the truth is, God is always at work behind the scenes. You may be in a season of uncertainty, a season where you don't have all the answers. But don't mistake silence for absence. Don't mistake delay for denial. If God has given you a promise, He will fulfill it in His time, not yours. So what do we do in the meantime? We trust. We walk by faith, not by sight. We remind ourselves daily that our future is in the hands of a God who never fails. That means we don't give in to fear. We don't let anxiety dictate our steps. We don't allow the enemy's lies to drown out the voice of truth. Instead, we stand firm in the knowledge that the same God who parted the Red Sea, who closed the mouths of lions, who raised the dead, is the same God who holds our future. And when you understand that, something incredible happens. You start living with a different kind of confidence. Not the kind of confidence the world offers, which is based on circumstances and success, but a confidence that comes from knowing that the one who spoke the universe into existence is the same one who is guiding your every step. That kind of confidence allows you to face uncertainty with peace. It allows you to walk through storms without fear. It allows you to look at an impossible situation and say, my God is greater. Some of you may be struggling right now. Maybe you've been praying for direction, asking God to show you what comes next. Maybe you feel like you've been waiting forever, and you're wondering if God even hears you. Let me tell you, He does. He sees you. He knows exactly where you are, and His plan is still unfolding, whether you realize it or not. If you're in a season of waiting, don't lose heart. If the path ahead seems unclear, don't be afraid. If everything around you is telling you that there's no way forward, don't believe the lie. God is not finished with you yet. His plans for you are good, His promises are true, and your future is in His hands. Hold on, keep trusting, because in the end you'll look back and realize that every step, every struggle, every moment of uncertainty was leading you to exactly where He always intended you to be. We live in a world that celebrates strength. Everywhere you look, people talk about being independent, powerful, self-sufficient. We're taught that showing weakness is a flaw, that admitting we need help somehow makes us less capable. But when we turn to the Bible, we find a truth that stands in stark contrast to what the world believes. God's Word tells us that our greatest strength is not found in our own abilities. It's found in our willingness to admit our weakness and rely fully on Him. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, the Lord speaks directly to this. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Think about that for a moment. God's power, His perfect, limitless power is made perfect in our weakness. That's not just a comforting thought, it's a life-changing revelation. It means that the very places where we feel the most broken, the most incapable, the most overwhelmed are the exact places where God's strength can shine the brightest. But let's be honest, that's not an easy truth to accept. We want to be strong. We want to have it all together. We want to face life's challenges with confidence and control. And when we fall short, when our strength runs out, it's easy to feel like we've failed. But God sees it differently. He never asked us to do it all on our own. He never expected us to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. In fact, He invites us to lay that burden down and lean into His grace. The Apostle Paul understood this better than anyone. Paul was a man who faced incredible trials, shipwrecks, beatings, imprisonment, and constant persecution. And yet through all of it, he remained faithful. But there was one struggle Paul couldn't seem to overcome. A thorn in his flesh, as he described it. We don't know exactly what it was, but we know it caused him great pain. And 3 times Paul begged God to take it away, but God's answer wasn't what Paul expected. God didn't remove the thorn. Instead, He said, "My grace is sufficient for you." Paul could have been discouraged. He could have let that unanswered prayer make him bitter. But instead, he embraced God's answer. He realized that his weakness was an opportunity for God's strength to be revealed. And so Paul declared, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." Now that goes against everything our human nature tells us to do. Boast about our weaknesses? That doesn't make sense unless you understand what Paul understood. Paul knew that when he reached the end of his own strength, that's when God's power took over. When he admitted his need, God's grace filled the gap. And because of that, Paul's life became a testimony to God's strength working through human weakness. And the same is true for you. Maybe right now, you're facing something that feels too big for you. A sickness that won't go away, a relationship that's falling apart, a financial burden that's crushing you. Maybe you've been trying to hold it all together, trying to push through on your own strength. And maybe, like Paul, you've been asking God to take it away. But what if God's answer is different than what you're expecting? What if instead of removing the struggle, He wants to meet you in it? What if He's allowing this season of weakness so that His strength can be made perfect in your life? That's not an easy thing to accept, but I promise you, there is power in surrender. When you stop trying to do it all on your own and invite God into your weakness, something incredible happens. His grace steps in. His strength takes over. And you find a peace that doesn't make sense, a peace that carries you through the storm, even when the storm doesn't. I've seen it happen time and time again. I've seen people walk through unimaginable loss and still find joy. I've seen people battle illness and still shine with hope. I've seen people face financial ruin and still live with generosity. How is that possible? It's not because of their own strength. It's because they've learned to rely on God's. And you can do the same. Whatever you're facing right now, you don't have to carry it alone. God is inviting you to lay down your burden and take up His grace. He's offering you a strength that never runs out, a power that is made perfect when yours fails. So don't be afraid of your weakness. Don't hide it, and don't be ashamed of it. Instead, bring it to God. Let Him meet you there. Let His grace fill the places where you feel empty. Let His strength carry you when you can't take another step. And when you do, you'll discover something beautiful. That the very thing you thought would break you is the thing God uses to show His power in your life. The struggle you thought would destroy you becomes the testimony that gives hope to others. And the weakness you try to hide becomes the platform for God's greatest work. So today, if you feel like you don't have the strength to go on, that's okay. You don't have to. God's grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in your weakness. And when you surrender to Him, you'll find that His strength is more than enough. There's something every one of us is searching for. Something more valuable than money, more precious than success. It's the one thing people chase after their whole lives but often never find. That thing is peace. Real, lasting, unshakable peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind of peace that stays with you even when the world around you is falling apart. We live in a time of constant noise. Every day we're bombarded with news of wars, disasters, and uncertainty. Social media tells us we're not good enough, not successful enough, not happy enough. Our minds are filled with worries about tomorrow, our health, our families, our future. Anxiety has become so common that it feels like a normal part of life. But let me tell you something. It's not supposed to be this way. The Bible gives us a promise, a hidden treasure that many of us overlook. In Isaiah 26:03, it says, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you." That's not just a comforting thought. That's a life-changing truth. God promises perfect peace. Not just a temporary sense of calm, not peace that comes and goes depending on how good life is going, but perfect, lasting, unwavering peace. But there's a condition attached to that promise. It says, those whose minds are steadfast. What does it mean to have a steadfast mind? It means keeping your thoughts focused on God. It means trusting Him even when life doesn't make sense. It means believing that God is in control even when everything around you feels out of control. And when you do that, the result is peace. Real peace, the kind the world can't give and the world can't take away. But let's be honest, that's not always easy. It's hard to keep your mind focused on God when you're facing bills you can't pay, when the doctor gives you bad news, when the people you love hurt you. It's hard to trust God when the future feels uncertain. But that's exactly when we need to do it the most. Think about the story of Peter walking on water. When Jesus called him out of the boat, Peter did something incredible. He actually walked on water. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and started focusing on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. The same thing happens to us. As long as our eyes are fixed on Jesus, we can walk through life's storms with peace and confidence. But the minute we let fear and worry take over, we start to sink. And that's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants to distract you with fear. He wants to fill your mind with doubt because he knows if he can steal your peace, he can keep you from living the life God called you to live. But you don't have to let him. You have the power to choose what you focus on. And when you choose to fix your thoughts on God, on His goodness, His faithfulness, His promises, you'll find that peace begins to rise up in your heart. That's not just something I've read about. That's something I've experienced. I've seen people walk through the darkest seasons of life with a peace that defies understanding. I've seen people lose everything, their job, their health, their loved ones, and still have joy. How is that possible? It's not because of their own strength. It's because they've learned the secret of perfect peace. They've learned to keep their minds steadfast, to trust God even when the answers don't come. And that's a lesson every one of us needs to learn. Because the truth is, storms will come. Life won't always go the way we plan. There will be days when the wind and waves seem overwhelming, but in the middle of it all, we have a choice. We can focus on the storm, or we can focus on the one who calms the storm. We can let fear take over, or we can stand firm in faith. The Bible tells us in Philippians 4, 6, and 7, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Did you catch that? God's peace will guard your heart and mind. That's not a fragile peace. That's a peace that stands like a fortress, protecting you from fear and anxiety. But there's something important we need to understand. Peace doesn't come from getting what we want. It doesn't come from everything working out perfectly. Peace comes from surrender. It comes from trusting that even when things don't go our way, God is still in control. It comes from knowing that even when life hurts, God's plan is still good. And that's the kind of peace I want for you today. A peace that isn't shaken by bad news. A peace that doesn't disappear when the bank account is low or the diagnosis is frightening. A peace that stays with you no matter what life throws your way. But to have that kind of peace, you have to make a choice. You have to choose to keep your mind steadfast. You have to choose to trust God even when it's hard. You have to choose to focus on His promises, not your problems. And when you do, you'll find that His perfect peace begins to fill your life in a way you never imagined possible. So today, whatever you're facing, whatever storm is raging around you, I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to live in anxiety. God's peace is available to you right now. All you have to do is fix your eyes on Him and trust that He is working all things together for your good. And when you do, you'll find that no matter how fierce the storm, you can stand firm because the peace of God will hold you steady. There's something incredible about the way God works. He never asks us to obey Him without a purpose. Every instruction He gives, every command He sets before us is not meant to restrict us, but to bless us. The problem is, too often we see obedience as a burden rather than a doorway to something greater. We hesitate, we resist, because we don't always see the immediate reward. But God's Word makes one thing clear. When we walk in obedience, He opens the floodgates of blessings in ways we never expected. The Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 28 verse 02, all these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. Think about that for a moment. God isn't saying if you obey me, I'll consider blessing you. No, He says the blessings will overtake you. That means they will chase you down, surround you, overwhelm you. But there's a key: obedience. Obedience isn't always easy, especially when it requires us to trust God beyond what we can see. Sometimes God asks us to take a step of faith before we know where that step will lead. Sometimes He asks us to let go of something we're holding on to before He shows us what's coming next. And that can be uncomfortable. But every time we choose to obey, something powerful happens. God moves in ways we never imagined. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland, to step away from everything familiar and go to a place he had never seen. God didn't give him all the details. He didn't lay out the entire plan. He simply said, go. And Abraham obeyed. And because he obeyed, God made him into a great nation. He blessed him beyond measure, not just for his own sake, but so that he could be a blessing to generations to come. What if Abraham had hesitated? What if he had let fear hold him back? He would have missed out on everything God had prepared for him. And the same is true for us. Sometimes we miss out on blessings, not because God doesn't want to give them, but because we're too afraid to take that step of obedience. But let me tell you something. God's blessings are always worth the cost of obedience. When you trust Him, when you follow His lead, even when it doesn't make sense. He shows up in ways you never expected. He provides in ways you couldn't have imagined. He moves mountains that seemed impossible. Maybe right now, God is calling you to obey Him in a specific area of your life. Maybe He's asking you to let go of something that's holding you back. Maybe He's calling you to forgive someone who hurt you, even when it's hard. Maybe He's leading you to step out in faith and do something that scares you. And maybe, like so many of us, you're wrestling with doubt, wondering if obedience is really worth it. Let me tell you, it is. Because when you obey God, you position yourself for blessings you can't even see yet. Doors begin to open. Opportunities begin to appear. Miracles start to unfold. And the best part? You realize that His plan was always better than yours. But here's something important to remember. Obedience isn't just about receiving blessings for ourselves. It's also about being a blessing to others. When you walk in obedience, your life becomes a testimony to God's goodness. People see His hand on your life, and it draws them closer to Him. Think about Peter. One day after fishing all night and catching nothing, Jesus told him to cast his net one more time. Now, Peter was an experienced fisherman. He knew the waters. He knew that after an entire night of catching nothing, it didn't make sense to try again. But instead of arguing, instead of relying on his own understanding, Peter simply said, "Because you say so, I will let down the nets." And what happened? His obedience led to a catch so great that his nets began to break. And not only was he blessed, but those around him were blessed as well. That's how God works. When we obey, the blessings don't just stay with us, they overflow onto those around us. Your obedience can change not only your life, but the lives of the people God has placed around you. Maybe you're waiting for a breakthrough right now. Maybe you've been praying for God to move, to open a door, to bring a miracle. But what if the breakthrough is waiting on your obedience? What if the blessing is already prepared, but God is waiting for you to take the step? Obedience is not about understanding every detail before you act. It's about trusting that God's ways are higher than ours, that his plans are always for our good. And when you trust him, when you step out in faith, you'll find that his blessings don't just meet your expectations, they exceed them. So don't be afraid to obey. Don't hold back because of fear or doubt. Trust that when God asks you to do something, it's always for a reason. And when you do, you'll look back and see that every step of obedience was leading you to something greater than you ever imagined. One of the most powerful and life-changing truths in the Bible is also one of the hardest for many people to fully accept. It's this: God loves you completely, unconditionally, and without reservation. And I'm not talking about the kind of love that depends on how good you've been or how many times you've gotten things right. I'm talking about a love so deep, so wide, and so strong that nothing you could ever do would make God love you more, and nothing you've ever done could make him love you less. But so often we struggle to believe that. We look at our mistakes, our failures, our weaknesses, and we convince ourselves that we're not good enough for God's love. We think we have to earn it, that we have to somehow prove we're worthy of his grace. But the truth of the Bible tells us something completely different. In Romans 5:8, it says, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Did you catch that? While we were still sinners. Not after we cleaned ourselves up, not after we got our act together. God loved us at our worst so much that he sent his son to die for us. That kind of love is hard for us to comprehend because it's so different from the conditional love we often experience in this world. But that's the love God has for you. And when you begin to truly understand that love, it changes everything. It changes the way you see yourself. It changes the way you see your past. It changes the way you approach your future, because when you know you are fully loved by the God who created the universe, you no longer have to live in fear or shame. You no longer have to strive for acceptance. You can rest in the knowledge that you are already accepted, already cherished, already enough. But here's where so many people miss it. They think God's love is based on their performance. They think if they pray enough, serve enough, give enough, then God will love them more. And if they fail, if they fall short, then maybe God's love will run out. But let me tell you something. God's love is 1 John 4:8 tells us that God is love. Love isn't just something God does. It's who he is. It's his very nature, and because of that, his love for you is constant and unchanging. There's nothing you can do to lose it because you never earned it in the first place. It was a gift from the very beginning. Maybe right now, you're feeling unworthy of that love. Maybe you've made some mistakes, big mistakes, and you're wondering if you've gone too far. Let me tell you right now, you haven't. There is no sin so great that God's grace can't cover it. There is no distance so far that his love can't reach you. Think about the story of the prodigal son. This young man took his inheritance, wasted it on reckless living, and found himself broken and ashamed. But when he finally decided to come home, what did his father do? Did he stand there with crossed arms, demanding an explanation? Did he make his son earn his way back into the family? No. The Bible says the Father saw him from a distance and ran to him. He embraced him, kissed him, and welcomed him home with open arms. That's a picture of God's love for you. No matter how far you've run, no matter what you've done, the moment you turn back to him, he's already running toward you. He's not waiting to condemn you. He's waiting to embrace you. And when you begin to live in the reality of that love, it frees you. You no longer have to carry the weight of guilt and shame. You no longer have to try to prove your worth. You can simply rest in the fact that you are loved fully, completely, and eternally. But there's something else that happens when you understand God's love. It changes the way you love others. When you've experienced the grace and mercy of God firsthand, you begin to extend that same grace and mercy to those around you. You become more patient, more forgiving, more compassionate, because you know what it's like to be loved at your worst, and you want others to experience that same love. That's why Jesus said the greatest commandments are to love God and love others. Because when you truly love God, when you know and receive his love, it naturally overflows into the way you treat people. And that kind of love has the power to change lives. So, if you're sitting here today wondering if God really loves you, let me settle it once and for all. He does. More than you could ever imagine. And his love isn't based on what you've done or where you've been. It's based on who he is. Don't spend another day trying to earn something that's already yours. Don't let fear or shame keep you from the love that's been reaching out to you all along. God's love is real, it's relentless, and it's waiting for you right now. There's a truth in the Bible that many people overlook. A truth so powerful that if you really grasp it, it will transform the way you live your life. It's this: God has a purpose and a calling for you. Not just for preachers, not just for missionaries, not just for people who seem especially holy, but for you. Right where you are, with your unique gifts, your unique story, and even your unique, God has called you to something greater than you could ever imagine. But too often we settle for less. We get caught up in the busyness of life, working a job, paying the bills, raising a family, and we start to believe that maybe we're just ordinary. Maybe God's purpose is for someone else. Maybe we've made too many mistakes or missed too many opportunities. But that's not the truth. The Bible makes it clear in Ephesians 2:10, for we are God's handiwork, created in advance for us to do good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. Did you hear that? God prepared good works for you before you were even born. He had a plan in mind for your life, a purpose tailor-made just for you. You are not an accident. You are not here just to exist, just to get by. You were created with intention. You were created with meaning. And when you begin to walk in that purpose, when you start living the life God called you to live, you'll experience a kind of fulfillment the world can't offer. But here's the thing. Walking in your purpose requires faith. It requires stepping out of your comfort zone and trusting that God knows what he's doing, even when you don't have all the answers. Look at Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses didn't feel qualified. He focused on his weaknesses, his insecurities. He said, Lord, I'm not a good speaker. I'm not the right person for this. But God didn't choose Moses because he was perfect. He chose Moses because he had a plan. And God's plan was bigger than Moses' doubts. Maybe you feel like Moses today. Maybe you're hearing God call you to something, but you're convinced you're not ready, not equipped, not good enough. But let me tell you something. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He's not looking for perfect people. He's looking for willing people. And if you'll say yes, if you'll step out in faith, even when it's uncomfortable, you'll see God do things through you that you never thought possible. But too often, fear holds us back. Fear of failure. Fear of what others will think. Fear of stepping into the unknown. But the Bible tells us in 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Fear is not from God, and it has no place in your calling. When God gives you a purpose, He also gives you the strength and the courage to fulfill it. And let me tell you something else. Your past does not disqualify you from God's purpose. Some of the greatest men and women in the Bible had broken pasts. David committed adultery. Paul persecuted Christians. Peter denied Jesus. But God didn't give up on them, and He's not giving up on you. If you've made mistakes, if you've taken some wrong turns, that doesn't mean God's purpose for you is over. He's a God of redemption, and He can use even your failures for His glory. But you have to be willing to take that first step. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to know every detail of the plan. You just have to be willing to say, here I am, Lord, use me. And when you do that, when you surrender your life to God's purpose, you'll find a sense of peace and fulfillment you've never known before. Maybe God is calling you to step out in faith in your career. Maybe He's calling you to serve in your church or your community. Maybe He's asking you to start that ministry, write that book, share your story. Or maybe your purpose right now is to love your family well, to be a light in your workplace, to show kindness to the people around you. Whatever it is, don't wait. Don't let fear or doubt keep you from the life God has called you to live. The world needs what God has placed inside you. Your gifts, your experiences, your testimony, they matter. They have the power to impact lives, to bring hope, to point people to Jesus. And when you step into your calling, when you start living with purpose, you'll find that God's plans for you are bigger and better than anything you could have dreamed. You'll see His hand guiding you, His grace sustaining you, His power working through you, and one day you'll look back and realize that every step of faith, every act of obedience, every sacrifice was worth it. So don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you feel ready. God is calling you now. And if you'll trust Him, if you'll take that first step, you'll discover a life of purpose, a life of impact, a life that brings glory to the one who created you. And that, my friend, is a life worth living.